So, hi everybody, welcome to our session today. I'm very happy to have Jake Gandy as chair, and Shey Fyffe will be our speaker. Just to remind you, I'll put a message in the chat, but on the 6th of December will be our final session of the for the winter term. And we'll be welcoming Melissa Mendes from Cardiff University, who will be talking about the decivilizing process of the state of Trinidad and Tobago, and that looks to be a really interesting talk. So I'm going to pass over the reins to Jake in the meantime. Thank you everybody for joining us, and we look forward to listening to this fantastic presentation.
Thank you, Eve. My name is Jake Gandy. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Manchester in history. And as Eve has said, we'll be hearing a paper from Shey Fyffe today. Shey is a lecturer in the School of Social Sciences at Birmingham City University. Shey's research explores Black political community organisation in contemporary Britain and the challenges that these organisations face in today's neoliberal context. It offers an engaged ethnography of grassroots organisations as counter-publican institutions and reveals the complex forms that these organisations take. So Shey's paper will take roughly around 45 minutes, and then we'll open up for questions. And as Eva said, you can either use the raise hand function or put them in the comments, and we'll get to them. So over to you, Shey.
Hi, thank you so much, Jake, and thank you also, Eve, for the introductions. My name is Shey Fyffe, and today I'll be presenting to you the future of contemporary Black community organisations in contemporary Britain. The future of Black community organisations in contemporary Britain and engaged ethnography. Then I decided to title this research "Reviving Radicalism," as I wanted to present the research as an exploration into the resurgence of Black community-based movement, mobilisation and response to racialised conditions, or to treatment that has been deemed to be a result of racialised inequality. We've all seen in the years past, the most recent years, especially from the beginning of the BLM movement, the real resurgence of this Black radical tradition that has a very long history. And hopefully we will get into some of that today. Okay, so please, could I have the next slide? Thank you. Also, hopefully I am speaking loud enough as well. I have a tendency to be a bit quiet spoken, so please do let me know if you aren't able to hear me very well. Okay, so the presentation of my research today is essentially a dissemination of my doctoral research, and I'm going to go ahead and present it to you in 3 phases. So the first phase is going to be the theoretical and conceptual frameworks which were engaged in the undertaking of this research. Phase 2, the provision of socio-historical context, so looking at the history of Black political mobilisation within the British nation state, and then an exploration of the empirical research, the research space, etc., and everything that entailed, alongside the findings in the space also. Could I please have the next slide? Thank you. So theory then, next slide. Right then, so excuse the wordiness of it all, but the ideological framework of this research was Black radicalism, and that is Black radicalism as it is theorised as an ideology by Andrews in 2018's book, Black Radicalism for the 21st Century, by Professor Gandy Andrews, who was my doctoral supervisor. So the ideology is or Black radicalism as an ideology is centred around the concept of global Blackness, which is a calling for the political unification of all individuals of African descent, or those that have descended from the continent of Africa, whether they are resided within the continent or they are resided diasporically around the world. Black radicalism is a political ideology that is concerned with the Black condition as it has been since the enslavement of people of African ancestry, otherwise referred to as the transatlantic slave trade or chattel slavery. So what is presented by Black radicalism is antithetical to a lot of the narratives that we hear from, say, liberal takes on Black politics, which essentially is we are living in a space or a time of that so much racial progressivism has undergone. By the way, also a side note, I do have a stutter, so I'm sorry if that also interrupts the fluency of my speech also. As I was saying, so Black radicalism disagrees with the narratives of racial progressivism, which dominate many discussions of racial equality, racial progression, and also the current state of Black people around the world. Black radicalism as an ideology very much states that the narratives of racial progressivism that are engaged with often to make the argument that racism is nowhere near as pervasive as it once was, or that so much progression has been made to bring about the equality of non-white demographics with those in terms of to their white counterparts, that there's no need to discuss racism anymore, or that racism has reached such a point in which it's now to be allocated to individual attitudes or shortcomings rather than systemic structures or conditions. And it does this by stating that we focus far too much on the Western condition of racial equality, even though, of course, that has its inequalities, of course, but we focus too much on the history of progressivism within the Western context, whilst forgetting the Black condition, whilst forgetting the Black condition in a global sense, if that makes sense too, in terms of looking at it as a global sphere. So Black radicalism takes a very global view on the Black condition, and sees and states that we have to take it from there, looking at those that are doing the worst, and then placing that as the bar of liberation. So Black radicalism is very concerned with the concept, of Blackness as a political identity. We, within the standard vernacular, when we speak of someone being Black, we're typically referring to their ancestral identity, but it is used as a racial signifier. To call someone Black is to say they're of African descent or descended in some way from the continent of Africa. However, Blackness in Black radicalism is looked upon as a political identifier of unity, not just a racial signifier. It's a political identity in and of itself, which was popularized in the 1960s, i.e. Black Power, and it's a call to action. The term of Blackness is a call to action for all of those who are oppressed and have been oppressed through racial hierarchies to come together as one in order to overthrow these systems of oppression. So how do we go about then building this or moving towards Black radical visions of liberation that come with overthrowing these systems? Black radicalism very much places that in the building of a Black radical counter-public, which is as stated on the screen, and I will read it verbatim, a parallel discursive areas where members of subordinated social groups invent and circulate counter-discourses to formulate oppositional interpretations of their identities, interests, and needs. And the Black radical counter-public is considered to be the Black community organisation is considered to be the cornerstone of the Black radical counter-public. And thus, that is where the importance of Black community organisations lies. So in the Black radical vision, as theorised here, the road to liberation very much lies in the power of the people, of the community. It's not something that can be outsourced to state power or waited upon or negotiated or coerced. It's something that has to be taken. And that is where we go into the concept of Black radical unity, which will be discussed on the next slide, please. Oh, actually, we're on racial capitalism, excuse me. Right then, so racial capitalism. So racial capitalism is a concept that is inherent to Black radicalism as an ideology. Anti-capitalism, the system of capitalism and the economic and political ramifications of capitalism has a lot to answer for, according to Black radical takes, as it pertains to the ongoing racialized oppression of people of colour and Black people around the world. And that responsibility is very much located in the Western creation of race, which is the key tool of Western capitalist expansion. So the concept of racial capitalism, which is originally presented by Cedric Robinson in the book Black Marxism, which is a fantastic book. I would suggest that you all go and read it. It's a bit dense, but it's good. It's a process of gaining social and economic value from another individual based upon their race. And essentially, one thing that very much came to the forefront when learning about the concept of racial capitalism is that prior to the racialization of people of color, which began in Europe, in the West, individuals of other European descents or individual ethnic differentiation was already taking place in Europe. And so the concept of race as a means, or allocating race as a means to differentiate one group of people or one demographic of people from another, whether it be based upon their language, their customs, or their ethnicity, because of course ethnicity and race are different. This is how race came to be, the allocation of hierarchy to difference. And so it was upon this allocation of hierarchy to difference, which often happened when groups, because early Europe around this time was very nomadic, groups of people would move around for work and settling. And when they would arrive somewhere, they'd be racialized as different, and then they would be deemed as socially inferior to those that had racialized them as such. And so it is this creation of race in the West that is rejected by Black radicalism and is substituted for Blackness. The difference being that race is something that is allocated to an individual or a group of people from another group that deem themselves superior to them, whereas Blackness is something that the people call themselves, and it is an empowering term. So it is the creation of race and the creation of the Negro upon which African chattel slavery was condoned and Western capitalism was expanded, creating the world that we currently know it. So a reference to media that I always tell my students when I'm lecturing in terms of the creation of the Negro is the very well-known scene in Roots, if anybody has watched the miniseries Roots, where the slave owner is attempting to have this enslaved gentleman Kunta Kinte accept his enslaved name, which is Toby, and he says, no, I refuse to call myself this. And essentially that is a process of the history, the pre-colonial history or pre-enslavement history and identity of people of African descent being stripped from them and then being made an economic category, them being having their ethnic ancestry or the outward markers of their ethnic ancestry, i.e. skin tone and features, hair texture, all of those things that categorize somebody of African descent as being so, at least more so in Western South Africa, most primarily, became a signifier of class. So in itself, race then became a class descriptor, or the colour of one's skin did. And so this is why Black radicalism rejects the concept of race, because race is very much linked to Black people as an economic category and as the working slave class. Next slide, please. Okay, here we are. So the conceptual framework for this piece of research was Black radical unity, and that is a concept that I termed, and I derived it from Andrew's concept of global Blackness, which is essentially this Pan-Africanist approach. Pan-Africanism, for anyone who isn't aware, is the philosophy that all of African descent, wherever they reside in the world, should see themselves as one body, as one political, economic, and cultural, and in time social, if it allows, a monolith essentially, because of the genealogical ancestry. Excuse me, fucking my throat today. Genealogical ancestry and history that we all share, whether you are of the continent and live there, reside there, or you live in the diaspora. So Black radical unity is the political transnational Pan-Africanist unity required to bring about the Black radical vision of liberation. And it's important that there's a differentiation made between other examples of Black transnational political unity that we see through Black political history. One of the examples of those is the United Negro Improvement Association, which is the organisation that was developed or established by political figure Marcus Garvey in 1914, I want to say. Yeah, definitely 1914. And that was a Pan-Africanist organisation, which on first glance, one may say, well, that was definitely a case of Black radical unity. And at this point, it's important to mention the political function of ideology. Garveyism, excuse me, or the UNIA, which was governed by Marcus Garvey, was a Pan-Africanist organisation, yes, because it called for the uniting of all Black people around the world. However, the ideology that they were all uniting under was not radicalism. It was not, unless it did not have radical objectives. It was more concerned with mirroring the existing capitalist system that was governed by the European or the Western nations. Essentially, the vision of Marcus Garvey was to create a Black version of the West in the continent of Africa. It's a very capitalist vision of Black liberation, which is, of course, rejected by the concept of Black radicalism and Black radical unity. So that is not Black radical unity because it is not governed by the ideology of Black radicalism. Another example was the Pan-Africanist Congress, which was established by Du Bois and W.B. Du Bois and many other individuals of the Black bourgeoisie within the African continent at that time. That whilst it was anti-capitalist in the sense that it was socialist, it was not radical, because it was not attempting to engage in radical politics in a direct way. It was more so a liberal movement that, in fact, actually wrote a letter to the Western nations, an open letter to ask for help with liberating the colonies and ending colonization in Africa and asking for Western cooperation, which just is not the Black radical way. Black radical way is very much based upon self-determination and doing for self, and then struggling to bring those visions to fruition rather than asking for permission. So just to move on in terms of the characteristics of Black radical unity, the first tenet or the first value is complete intracommunal egalitarianism. Now, aside from the critique of capitalism, Garveyism and other Black political ideologies and trains of thought, i.e. Black cultural nationalism specifically, has been criticised by myself, by Gandy Andrews and by others for not providing the ideological or not ideologically facilitating Black egalitarianism. So we'll have these ideologies to purpose to lead people of African descent to liberation. However, within the community itself, this same socio-cultural and socio-political hierarchies, social hierarchies still exist, which then excludes and marginalizes certain demographics of the Black community within those spaces itself. So for that reason, Black radicalism as an ideology and Black radical unity divorces itself from socio-cultural hierarchies and systems of them, i.e. patriarchy/misogyny, or misogynism, heterosexism, and any other form of social or cultural hierarchical system that can be applied to a group of people that can cause division. Anything that can cause division, everybody is completely equal. The only qualifying marker for to be inclusive within Black radical unity, within the actual action of itself, is to be of African descent, and that is the only, and to also embrace the politics, which is anti-capitalist and has socialist visions, and the building of a Black nation, of course, Black counter-publican nation. So the second value is a commitment to contribute towards grassroots community organisation and the building of a Black radical counter-public, as I've mentioned. And that can be in multiple ways. Becoming involved in activism is not something that is that looks the same for everyone. However, this research is more so focused upon the actual getting involved in community organisations. And in the abstract, it said bricks and mortar organisation for a specific reason, because of course with the beginning of the digital age and things moving online so much, there are forms of activism that aren't always taking place in person. And so this research is very much concerned with the requirement of individuals to actually physically be present and building actual actual services in person that do not provide the same convenience and same flexibility as partaking in digital activism also, and what that looks like in a contemporary society with the way in which life is going, and the binding of individual fate more and more so to socioeconomic positioning, and therefore the prioritization of earning a living, right, above anything else. So the next slide, thank you. So phase 2, the provision of socio-historical context. So much of the history that we have been exposed to, at least personally, that I can say, even as somebody that attended Black supplementary school throughout my childhood, is that it's very American-centric, very US-centric. And so upon writing my literature review the first time round, I decided to, well, I actually sort of went the path of least resistance and wrote an American-centric literature review of Black political history. And then I thought, hold on, I better just go back and actually locate it in Britain. So here we are. So thank you. Next slide, please. Okay, then. So I have outlined Black radicalism as an ideology, and now it is required that it's outlined as a tradition, because prior to it existing as an ideology, it is a tradition first and foremost. And to state or to define it, as stated on the slide, the Black radical tradition is the continuing development of a collective consciousness informed by the historical struggles for liberation and motivated by the shared sense of obligation to preserve the collective being, the ontological totality. Now, the terms collective being very much encompasses the unity that is required for the Black radical tradition, and the ontological totality is another term that really rings true with me. The totality of one's ontology, of course, the philosophy ontology, the philosophy of being, of existence. The Black radical tradition is very much committed to maintaining an awareness in a cross-generational awareness and memory of the history of Black struggle and of discrimination and marginalization and all of it, the whole history, and not forgetting it. And that very much is what the Black radical tradition encompasses. So it places the experience of those of African descent at the ontological center of political thought and of action, and very much brings this Afrocentric center to mobilization, Afrocentricity being the antithesis of Eurocentricity or Eurocentricity. So the Black political ideologies and movements, i.e. Black liberalism, Black feminism, Black cultural nationalism and liberal radicalism, which are all Black political ideologies that are separate from Black radicalism, the one that the ideological framework for this piece of research of the Black radical tradition are primarily concerned with confronting and or disrupting the hierarchical structures and systems that sustain the racial hierarchy on a global scale. So there are a number of Black political ideologies, of movements, of mobilizations, of writers, of thinkers that all sit within that Black radical tradition. And so they are all inclusive. So while they may not all be deemed, as it pertains to the theorization used, Black radicalism, because of their inability to, or not necessarily inability, but they don't address certain issues that need to be addressed, that have been seen in real life, Black community organizations of the past, they are not classified as being Black radicalism in and of themselves, but they are part of the tradition. Next slide, please. Okay, so one thing that I learned was that there was a Black radical tradition in Britain prior to mass migration, which is typically placed in after the World War. So some early examples of mobilized responses to the oppressed Black condition that predates the mass migration of Caribbean and Asian communities into Britain. And one of them was Nigerian Progress Union, the West African Student Union, the League of Coloured People, and the Coloured Seamen's Union, which I knew about I heard about the first three in passing, but the fourth, the Coloured Seamen's Union, very much intersects the anti-racist movement with the labour movement and the union movement, which takes a very big resurgence during the 80s. When we see the neoliberalisation of the British economy and the political landscape of Britain, which we'll speak about a little bit later. But essentially the Coloured Seamen's Union was founded because they were not being, and it was not just seamen of Caribbean descent. It was all non-white seamen, which also has its own political tradition within Britain as well. The unification of Black and Asian communities, it is a collective against racism in Britain. So that is just a little overview of some of the pre-World War II mobilisations. The bottom picture is of Harold Moody, who was a Caribbean physician who was residing in London and began the civil rights organisation, the League of Coloured People, which is heard about a lot less than the NAACP is, which is situated much further away from us, and also the civil rights movement, which was headed up by Martin Luther King. So I think there needs to be a bit more of a British-centred Black political education provided. Next slide, please. Right, so the Windrush period, 1948 to 1971. This is essentially the beginning of, or I want to say the beginning of the Black struggle, but as I've mentioned, it wasn't, but it was at the beginning of the mass Black struggle within Britain. There was a migration of migrants from Commonwealth countries. Of Jamaica was the main Caribbean island, and other Commonwealth nations, and they were invited here to actually fill labour shortages following the war, which is also a piece of information that is often omitted from Black British political history, and definitely is oppositional to a lot of the narratives that we were seeing in terms of racist discourse within the public sphere, i.e. go back to where you came from, go home, when actually these individuals were invited here. My grandparents included were definitely included in the Windrush generation. So migrants arrived to racial discrimination and lack of access to housing, healthcare, education and employment. So during this period of time, individuals were invited here. However, there were no legal protections for non-white, the new non-white British migrants who were actually already British citizens. For those of you that don't know, between 1948 and 1962, which was the passing of the first Immigrations Act, which attempted to restrict these freedoms, these rights, anyone that was residing in a Commonwealth nation was classified as a child of empire, therefore a British citizen. And so all of the procedures that we have now and regulations, visas and all these things just weren't an issue because you already had a British passport. So but they arrived and there was no provision for them to be treated equally, and they were not prepared. When I say they, I mean both the British public and those that were on their way, for living with individuals that didn't look like them. And so ensued the next decade or so of rampant racial discrimination, poor living conditions, because many Black families were unable to access equal living. Many landlords didn't actually rent to Black people or Asian people or Irish people either. So it was there was a major housing crisis, not because of a lack of rooms or a lack of homes, but a lack of willingness to provide housing for these families or for these young people that had come over to work. And the same can be said in education and employment also. May I also have the next slide, please? Thank you. Right then, so a major point of discussion within this piece of research is the relationship that was developed between the Black community and the British nation state following their arrival to Britain. One thing that I mapped throughout the history of Britain, of the history of British political movement or Black British political mobilisation, was that there seemed to be a reactionary nature of the British state as it pertained to people taking to the streets and just saying, okay, we've had enough now. And while there were community rumblings or community-based rumblings or conflicts between Black and white communities, i.e. the 1958 riots taking place in Notting Hill, London, and spreading throughout London, and also in Nottingham, which is the city that I'm from. Aside from those sorts of little rumblings and riots, there wasn't very much mobilised, organised organised mobilisation amongst the Black community that was of any national or any widespread significance. It never really reached from one country to the other until 1963, which saw the Bristol bus boycott. Now, the Bristol bus boycott took place because there was an issue with the Bristol bus company due to their refusal to hire, their open refusal, based upon the fact that it was not illegal, because the first piece of race relations reform had not been passed yet. And so up until this point, it was perfectly legal for an employer to say to an individual who was of Black or Asian descent, I'm not hiring you because you're not white, and then nobody wants to see non-white people, so we're not hiring you. And so this inspired the Bristol bus boycott, where the residents of Bristol decided that they were not going to patron the bus service of Bristol, and that unity that they showed towards the bus company lasted for 4 months. Nobody used the bus for 4 months. It was a boycott that was inspired by the Montgomery bus boycott, which had taken place in America just under 10 years before, and it ended up being a success. And this is also placed into the labour union history, the Black labour union struggle also. So in 1965, the passing of the first Race Relations Act took place, and that is credited quite heavily to the Bristol bus boycott. It's just a shame that had to take place in order for the 1965 Race Relations Act to be passed. And what did this do? It outlawed racial discrimination in public places, i.e. in places of service and also the workplace as well. And of course, that is all well and good, but it still continued to happen, as it was only punishable if it could be proved. So then in 1967, we had the beginnings of the British Black Power movement and the popping up of quite a few Black Power organisations throughout the country. Off the top of my head, of course, the British Black Panthers, the Black United Liberation or Black Liberation Front, the Black United Freedom Party was also one as well, the Fyffes. These were all established between 1967 and 1971. So between that cluster of the mid to late 60s and early 70s, there was just an explosion of Black Power organisations that popped up around the country, mostly in London. So 1968 was the height of the movement and engagement in the Black Power movement in the UK. Public petitioning against racist Commonwealth immigration of 1968 was another point that caused me to present the relationship between the nation state and the Black community as one of negotiation, one in which the state would give a little bit more, give a little bit of reform, grant a little bit of access in order to dissuade or subdue Black radical organisation or Black radical movement within the Black community, in order to keep the Black community from becoming too radical. So even though the mobilisation and all of the protests and the development of these organisations was garnering state attention, it was only really bringing about access and bring about increased access and racial progressivism for the purpose of meeting the demands, so that the Black community organisations, which were the counter-publican institutions upon which the Black radical vision of liberation was to be realised, it was to subdue them or to let them know that there was no need for you to be in existence anymore. 1968 was a pivotal year because of the passing of the 1968 Commonwealth Immigration Act, which was an act that essentially drawed more stricter regulations upon the same act of 1962, which was the revoking of the British passport, as I mentioned a few moments ago, of those who lived or were born in Commonwealth countries. So prior to that point, you were automatically a British citizen. After 1962, as a means to slow down immigration, that right was revoked. And then, of course, there were now more steps that one would have to go through to enter Britain. the British Black Panther Party were on the front line of petitioning the revoking of this law, and said it was and deemed it as a racist law, essentially, which is what it was. That was targeting Caribbean people and Asian people from being able not only just to come into the country, but also those that already lived here from being able to go home and see their family, because their status would then be contested upon their attempt to try and re-enter the country. So this was also became a part of the transnationalist identity of the politics, not just concerned with the Black condition in Britain, but also the Black condition at home. I'm aware of time, so I'm going to try and speed along a little bit. 1968's Relations Act was then passed that same year, which I present as also trying to calm down the Black British Panthers and say, well, things are getting better for you here, so you don't need to worry about the Black and brown people across the border, which is antithetical to the Black power politics. Next slide, please. Right, so just a quick overview of the tenets of Black power politics, which you'll notice align very much with Black radicalism, because Black radicalism is derived from Black power politics. So Pan-Africanist, anti-capitalist and community-based and led, and also very much concerned with a borderless Black unity, not concerned with the Black condition just in the country, but also around the world as a global condition. Blackness is a global identity. So the tenets are Black self-determination, being able to govern one's own destiny, autonomy, and then of course liberation, which is only found at the realization of the two before, Black self-determination and Black autonomy. So of course the objective of Black power politics was to build a worldwide Black nation independent from the control of the mainstream political and economic systems that govern the world as we know it today. Next slide, please. Okay, so just a quick overview of how the nation state de-radicalized Black community organizations and mobilization within Britain. So we've gotten to the beginning, or we've got to the end of the 1960s. The Black Power movement is still, it's still on the upward swing. It's about to enter its downward, its decline, but it's still very popular. 1968 was also a very significant year for the injection of funds into community programs tailored to Black communities. However, this injection of funds had political strings. So there was a launching of a program by the Labour government in 1968, which lasted all the way up until 1981, which, if you're privy of the years, the decades of political history in general, you'll know was just after Thatcher came into power. The government provided mass, not just to Black communities, but Asian communities that had been essentially abandoned by the state through their lack of legalizing or making racism illegal, and literally state sanctioning poverty for Black and brown people because of the lack of legal protection for these demographics. So councils that were able to prove that they had a significant need for their Black and brown communities were provided with funds to create Black community spaces that provided aid with housing, education, childcare, healthcare, and also finding employment. And this was the beginnings of the Black self-help movement. For those of you that are familiar with the Black supplementary school movement, that is also included within the Black self-help movement. So these were state-funded community spaces. However, and also it's important to say as well, this was great because this is essentially what the Black Power movement has been petitioning for. The state should pay for Black and Asian communities to have equal access to public services because they're experiencing so much racism within the mainstream ones, the ones that already are. However, the money did have strings, and so it stated that, if we will give you this money, however, as an organization, because many of the organizations or groups that received these funds were already established Black Power organizations, and they were hoping that they were able to mirror the success of the Black Panthers in America, the American context, which I won't go into too much, but they had created a whole range of community-based programs while still being able to engage in insurrectionist politics and Black radical politics too, which had also been state funded. However, that was not the case, that was not to be. The state said, if you are to receive these funds, you need to distance yourself from agitative political activity. And so that is how the spaces themselves became de-radicalized and became divorced from the politics. The second was the absorption of Black Power public politics into state race political agendas. So at the beginning of the 1980s into the 1990s, there was a mass migration, I want to say mass migration, but migration of a lot of Black political activists from the community work that they had been doing for the past decade or so into leftist politics, Labour politics, a lot of collaboration between Labour MPs and Black political activists. And we saw the slow absorption of those Black Power activists into state political agendas and taking them, which took them away from the grassroots. So a quote that I have here, which is a quote from Tony Soares, who was a member of a Black Power organisation, reads as such. So a lot of money was going in from the state, employing people, channeling them into community work and taking them away from political work. They all got caught up in some kind of project or the other because there was money on a scale they'd never seen before. So what essentially happened was the purchasing of Black Power activists into leftist state political agenda, which was focused upon race relations, upon improving racial equality, however, upon the terms of Labour politics. So within the framework of the nation state political agenda, rather than the independent counter-publican movement that had been the Black radical vision to begin with. Next slide, please. So then we have the significance of the neoliberal turn, which I can probably maybe skip over because I can speak about it in the but I'll just give a quick overview, speak about it in the analysis element. So the end of the 1970s, we saw the arrival of neoliberalism, which was introduced by the Thatcher government and had very much also, like most things in England, been inspired by the introduction of it into the American political system. Very close relationship with the American president at the time, Margaret Thatcher, restructured the political and economic landscape of Britain to make it conducive to the thriving of personal business. We are still all living under such bondage today, so I don't think I need to go into it too much, so you all know. However, for the Black Power movement and for the Black radical vision of liberation, what had happened is that there was now this assumption that the race relations acts of the 1960s and the 1970s, I think the last one was passed in 1976, had now leveled the playing field so much so, racially, I'm referring to, of course, that now there was no need to be concerned with political change in order to bring forth any further equality. And now the focus needed to be on, the focus of Black visions of liberation needed to be placed in the economic sphere. And so what we saw was this intersecting of, or co-opting rather, of Black radical ideals of self-determination and self-autonomy into the neoliberal values of individualism, self-responsibility.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt, Shey. We've got about 5 minutes left.
Oh my goodness, please, next slide. I'm so sorry.
Oh, no, it's fine. It's really enjoyable so far.
Okay, next slide, empirical research. Okay, so you can go to the next slide. Next slide. Okay, so very quickly then, my research was, I probably should have started with this, was a critical ethnography. It was an ethnography, which essentially is a research method concerned with observing and documenting life experiences. I was required to become immersed in the research space and gather notes on everything that I saw, every conversation I heard, even the little details, I was required to take notes on them. The ethnography was framed by the ideology of Black radicalism. So essentially I was concerned with how the conditions of contemporary society serve as obstacles to the future of Black community organizations. Next slide, please. So I was required, and it's an engaged ethnography, and there are many different types of ethnography, but an engaged ethnography is essentially when the researcher has to become indistinguishable from the other social actors in the space. So I was required to become a named or have a named role within the organization, and that was the secretary. I ended up becoming the secretary of the governing board of the organization, and I conducted all of the role responsibilities that a secretary would do, which alongside collecting data, and I was teaching at the time also as a teaching assistant, and also a PhD, was just a lot of work. But it's the ethnography life, ethnographic life, I suppose. So I was immersed in the space, and I was collecting research over a period of 18 months. However, because of the culture of distrust that Black community organisations have of individuals that they see as representative as institutions of authority, i.e. the government, i.e. the education system, healthcare, and the university, I had to spend a lot of time building trust. And so I ended up having to spend 10 months in the space before I even began collecting data as a secretary, so that they not necessarily forgot that I was a researcher, but that they trusted me. And then I was in there for 18 months, and then a little bit after that too. So the total time that I spent in the organisation was a period of 2 years and 6 months, so 2.5 years in the organisation, by which point I was part of the furniture. So next slide, please. So the research base was a community organisation in the West Midlands, UK. It had been in its current state officially established in 2016. However, it was an organisation that was emerged. It was a merger between two organisations that were local to one another. One was an elder organisation that had been around since 1973 and actually had come into existence as a recipient of urban programme funding, as aforementioned, and the other one was established in 2013. Both were of the Black radical tradition, yet it was only the younger organisation that claimed Black radicalism as a political identity. And so when the organisations merged, the elder organisation bringing assets, i.e. money and properties that it had managed to keep from its urban funding programme, which is no mean feat, because many organisations no longer have their buildings. The younger organisation was able to inherit the funds and the properties as a headquarter. One of those properties as a headquarters, and one of the other properties as passive income, because it was being rented out. And so it was a mutually beneficial merge, and that is how the organisation came to be. Next slide, please. So in my analysis, or in my time in the organisation, there were three main relationships that were highlighted as being pivotal to the future of the organisation. So the first one was that of the relationship between the board members, and was seen as was highlighted as intergenerational issues, essentially. That between the organisation and the board members, so the board members and their commitment to the organisation, and that between the organisation and the local Black community. Next slide, please. So intergenerational divisions then. So one of the major interpersonally based forms of division within the space was intergenerational, and that is essentially division between two different generations of people. So the board, because it was two different organisations, one elder, one younger, a majority of the board members were from the younger organisation, and then we had about 3 or 4 members that were from the elder organisation.
Sorry to interrupt again, Shey. Please can we try and wrap up now?
Yeah, fine.
Sorry.
Maybe we can pick it up in the Q&A.
Yeah, sure, but we'll pick it up in the questions.
Sorry, I knew I'd go over.
Oh no, it's fine. It's fine.
Thank you very much, Jake.
Yeah, thank you for that. So we can just move on to some questions now, and hopefully try and pick up anything that's outstanding. So if anyone either wants to leave the questions in the comments or use the raise hand function, then we can move on to the questions. And thank you, of course, for it was really wonderful. And I know I'm sure I'll speak for everyone. We could have listened all night, but just to try and engage and get some questions and get some conversation going.
You might have the hand raised.
Can I just check quickly? We had a message saying that somebody was having sound difficulty. Can everybody hear okay? Is everybody, yeah, everyone can hear okay. Fantastic, thank you.
I'm worried it might have been me speaking too quietly, if that is the case. Everyone else could hear.
No, yeah, I could hear fine, yeah. Yeah, so I had a question because and what I really enjoyed about the talk was how the extent you went to historicize a lot of these movements, which is so important, and in the field of modern British history, especially, it sort of overlooks the racial aspect of this. So a lot of the movements that, so for example, one of the big sort of meta narratives of modern British history is the decline of community, and whereas if we analyze the movements from a racial perspective, we see that, well, community didn't decline at all. It was very much thriving in the face of state atrocities, etc. So I did really enjoy the historicizing aspect of it. But my question was to do with the role of locality and regional perspective of this, because my research looks at Manchester in particular, and despite some of the aims of these political organizations to create a Black radical counter-public, there were very real internal differences on the ground, and these sometimes see that they manifest themselves quite in sometimes quite complex ways. But I'm just trying to get to the question is what's the role of local and regional differences? So is the example of London, is it different to Birmingham, for example, or Manchester? And the concrete differences on the ground, how does that feed into the formation of these political organizations?
In the context of the Caribbean community specifically, this research was conducted within West Midlands, which has the biggest Caribbean community outside of London, and so much of the embrace of radical politics within not just as major cities, Birmingham and London, but also as having that Caribbean community basis there is very much that history is very much located in these two spaces specifically, is very much directly located to the Caribbean, the Caribbean majority of the community in those areas at that time. I found at first, before I actually got into the research, I did toy with the idea of conducting interviews around the country to sort of draw those regional and local differences out. However, with the data that I actually collected, it was just there was such a plethora of things to discuss. I didn't find it to be necessary, or not necessarily necessary, but couldn't fit it in, because of course it's necessary. But I think with the local and the local differences is very much that, because I'm from the East Midlands, and this is conducted in the West Midlands, and even within the East Midlands, that Black radical tradition isn't as it's not as well established as it was within the West, and I think that's definitely due down to the size of the community and the size of the city as well. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, definitely. And I suppose it links as well that a lot of these communities, even though they were responding to particular local context, there was, as you say, they were always within the tradition of like the Black Atlantic and the framework of being inspired by diasporic of politics. And then we see those links with, you know, some of the activists in for example, Manchester were very much involved in Birmingham, in London. So and I suppose that comes under the framework again of creating this Black radical tradition that transcends any geographical boundaries.
Yes, of course. There was one slide, and I didn't touch on the point, but when we speak of the Black Power movement and when we're speaking of as a movement, so there's plenty of organizations within a movement, and there were different strands of the Black Power movement. There was the Marxist or /Marxist Leninist revolutionary strand, which is very much depicted by Black Panther Party and Black Liberation Front and these sorts of organizations. And then you have the cultural nationalist strand of Black Power politics, which very much places Black liberation within culture, which you'll see, for some examples, you'll see sort of the Rastafarian movement, for example, which isn't so much focused on overthrowing the current system, but more so withdrawing and not engaging with it. It's more about a changing of self and liberating oneself through culture. And that was a major contention within the Black Power movement, the organisations that subscribed to the more Marxist-Leninism and black socialist thought that was also gaining popularity had been quite popular for a while in the continent of Africa, the Black Socialist movement, and the cultural nationalist sects that were not interested so much in, aside from the thoughts of Marcus Garvey and that political take on, or theorization on, the world and on the racial inequality within it. Rastafarianism wasn't so much concerned with political confrontation, more so just withdrawing and living outside of, quote unquote, we would call it Babylon.
Yeah. I think it was Ruth raised hands first.
Oh, hello, Ruth.
Hi, Shey. I have a question, but just prior to, well, my question has more than one bit. Before the question, I just wanted to mention, in terms of Moody and the organization, you were making a point about us not knowing enough about the work of Moody. But what is interesting to know just at this moment in time is Una Morrison was very much connected with the Moody organization. And just within the last 2 weeks, Lenny Henry's production company put on, they produced a profile of Una Morrison, which was broadcast on BBC. So it's well worth people trying to look that up, because it would still be available. She's such an important figure. And also, of course, being a woman is part of why we need to know more about her. But she is also an interesting link between Jamaica, between what was happening in London, what was also happening on the literary scene, and Caribbean Voices tied into that. But also, she was secretary to Haile Selassie when he was in exile in Bath. So she's a very, very interesting figure, because her life sits at the crossroads of multiple components of community life, a kind of variety within the range of community life. So that's just that's the kind of a comment. I wondered if Stuart Hall fits into your Black radical framework.
Mm-hmm.
And then that's the sort of part one of the question. And the second bit is, I'm interested in hearing about if possible, about the results of your engagement on the committee with the two groups, because I'm wondering if there wasn't some measure of culture clash between the elderly members of the group and the young members of the group. The elderly ones are probably very closely connected with the Caribbean or African countries. The younger ones would have been socialized and brought up within Britain. And there is a mighty gap culturally between the environments. So, and why this matters is a part of the Black radical agenda that you've been speaking about. A major part of it sits on a basis of egalitarianism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it's this is a mega challenge, of course, within every single community of any nature. It is certainly a major challenge within a Black community, because egalitarianism is an issue that people like to say they believe in, but to espouse that in practice, espouse that in theory, but also put it into practice is two completely different things. Mm-hmm. Or can be completely different things. So that's the focus of my question really is, I would like to just hear a brief summary of your conclusions of the experience that you had observing the behavior patterns and the dynamic within the framework of the community between the younger and the older members. Thanks.
Thank you for the information on the lady. Is Una?
Una Marson, UNA Marson.
Yes,
Yeah.
She was definitely one of my political figures when I was conducting my literature review. Thank you very much for that. In response to your question regarding Hall, I do engage with Hall twice within the research, and that is first to discuss race and race as a floating versus a fixed signifier. Hall's presentation of race as a floating signifier as due to race having different meanings based upon the period of time in which we're in, or the space that which we're in, is highlighted as being an idea that's essentially rejected by Black radical perspective, because Blackness is seen, race is replaced with Blackness. So essentially Blackness, because it is a fixed political, not just a political, but also an experience, political identity and experience, Black radicalism does not accept the idea of race, or your race being having different meaning based upon the period of time in which we're in, because it does not necessarily entertain the perception of race from the outside looking in, or from above below. It's not concerned with it's not concerned with racial progressivism, essentially. So it's not concerned with racism as a floating signifier or the changing meaning of race, because Blackness is always fixed, and not placing racial condition or the Black condition within cultural or social sensibility, but rather within structural and systemic condition. So we engage with race. I engage with Hall's race as a floating signifier to reject it. But also I do also acknowledge that it does hold weight in terms of racial progressivism within contemporary society. You know, of course, there has been a liberalization of attitudes towards those who are ethnically or racially different to ourselves as time's gone on, right? So I do acknowledge that. In terms of,
hang on. That's a little confusing for me. So let me just try and am I right in thinking that Blackness, as you're defining it, is an experiential thing as opposed to a physical thing?
It's experienced by those that have been racialized as Black, or of African being as Black. Yes, so those that have been racialized as Black have a racialized experience of the world.
You mean that people from outside themselves have racialized them, or how they see themselves?
That racialize them outside of themselves.
So how is that different from that's a little, you made a distinction earlier on about race being something that's imposed on you from outside, but Blackness being something that you accept as part of your identity, that you take on. So yeah. So
I can clarify that a little bit further. So the rejection of race as a floating signifier is really more so a rejection of this idea that the changing meaning of race as it is imposed upon you, i.e. those that lived 50 years ago who are Black will have a worse, quote unquote, worse experience of racism than those that are.
Okay.
However, that is not, and that perspective isn't entertained by Black radicalism, because that's not seen as an indicator of the Black condition. Not how much racism you encounter on a day-to-day basis is not reflective of liberation. It's not equal to being free. So this racially progressivist discourse of, well, you know, we have all of these laws that mandate racial equality. There are Black people and brown people in the Houses of Commons. There are all these things, so racism is over, is not a reality that's accepted by Black radicalism.
Okay, I understand that.
So the structures it's the structures and the systems of racism that are the racist conditions, not the not the meaning of race at any one given time.
Yeah, okay. So it's basically what you're saying, it's a really complex web of experience that is supported in large part by the institutions which support life as we live it on a day-by-day basis.
Okay, shall we move on? There's a question in the chat from April Louise, if we can just move on to that, if that's okay.
Yeah.
So the question posed by April Louise, it says, how would you say that the Black Lives Matter movement fits into the Black radical unity, or indeed does it?
So thank you for your question, April Louise. I would say that the BLM movement, structurally, as a decentralized movement, that is very much has its objectives based upon the local, of course, the wider Black condition, but the issues that are impacting Black people locally. Provide that I don't, lots of people criticize this decentralized structure of BLM, but I actually think it's a good thing because it allows for that localized addressal of issues. I would classify BLM as liberal radicalism, however, because it is, yes, it is a grassroots organization with radical objectives. However, it does very much still garner a lot of its support based upon its public facing, state facing profile. As it pertains to egalitarianism, I think BLM has made great strides in providing more eyes and discourse around the decades-long, centuries-long marginalization of the LGBTQIA community within the Black community. The founders of the BLM organization, the three whose names I always forget because I'm terrible with names, but the three ladies who founded the organization and the movement essentially have always been very much concerned with not just racism and police brutality and all of these issues that afflict the Black community, but also issues that afflict the Black community intracommunally as well, IG heterosexism and patriarchy and heteropatriarchy and all of these other socio-cultural systems. So I think that BLM sits within that concept of Black radical unity by really breaking down those cultural barriers that have been built up with the, over time, the equating of Blackness to specific identities or Black authenticities to specific identities. I think BLM really has an important role in bringing those discourses out in political spaces. I hope that answers the question.
Yep, I'm sure it does. I think Nonki, apologies if I haven't pronounced that wrong, had your hand up. Is the question, do you still want to ask the question?
Yeah, I will actually. I'd put it down because I thought it was quite related to the second part of Ruth's question. So thank you for the talk. It's really interesting. I would really, I'm interested in the choice you made to use ethnography as a method in this kind of research. I think it's a really interesting choice when obviously you can do so much in kind of the books of like, there's so much work to be done on historicizing the history of Black radical movements, but to take that, what made you choose to like take it outside of that and to go into like actual ethnographic research? I'm interested to hear what you.
So thank you for your question. The decision to conduct an ethnography was very much based in my preoccupation with Black radical futures and the translation of these discourses, these Black radical discourses that we're seeing become more mainstream, not just on the internet, digital media, but also mainstream media as well, and the increase of images of this sort of it feels like this transporting back to the 1960s. That's honestly how I felt when I was watching the BLM protests of 2020. Anyway, around the George Floyd tragedy, and also Breonna Taylor as well. Rest in peace to them both. But essentially, what made me choose to actually go into an organisation and conduct this ethnography was to look at things as they are now. What is the issues facing Black community organisations on the ground now? Bricks and mortar organisations, places where people have to physically go, because we're seeing this ongoing digitisation of activism, which is all very well and good, very convenient, and has many upsides to it, very many positives. However, the nation must be concrete. It must be something that people can walk into. So I really wanted to capture that in real time. Really wanted to capture Black political history in real time, because today is tomorrow's history, right? Yeah. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you.
There's a question from Eve, but it won't let her raise her hand because she's host, but we'll go to Eve now.
Yeah, first and foremost, thank you, Shey, so much. I really enjoyed your presentation, particularly the way that you guided us through the essential theory really at the beginning, and then brought it to your research, because I think it's always important to kind of revisit those ideas and remember, you know, the roots of kind of where this activism is, you know, is based in. So the question I had, I'm really fascinated by the idea of the state kind of strategically shifting its strategies, changing its strategies basically as a way of undermining or trying to fracture basically different forms of either radical dissent or Black activism, and particularly I found it fascinating the way that, for example, the history, the background that you put towards of you know, the Black radical activism, even, you know, dating back to the 20s, and I think it's really important that we remember that that's been something that's been fundamental and always there, right, as part of this as part of our social fabric. I thought that was really useful, but yeah, just thinking about kind of more contemporary type strategies that the state implements in the form of kind of NGOs, right? The NGOization of different protest movements, and the way that, you know, these things are seen as kind of the veneer of kind of helping people or reaching out to communities, but actually it's also a way of kind of controlling them. My thinking at the moment would be, for example, the Windrush compensation scheme, and the way that, you know, the Home Office is using its funds basically to say, we're going to reach out to different community groups because we want you to speak to people who are affected. We want you to bring them into the fold, so to speak, and that way we can solve an issue. But really, it's a way of also controlling and monitoring, right? And also seeing a form of I wouldn't go as far as to use the word spying on communities, but certainly keeping tracks about who is active and who is doing what. So I just wondered what your thoughts were really on that, and going to how historically the state has changed tactics, and what it's been doing basically to kind of undermine or weaken these protest movements that you were talking to us about.
Thank you so much for that question, and that is a major point of discussion that very much plays into this de-radicalization of Black communities-led spaces, and the difference between a movement being community-based and being community-led, and that the two are, why they are synonymous, they're not one and the same. I'm so glad that you actually brought up the Windrush situation, because the church that I actually grew up in became one of those community midway points between the state and the community, having a large Caribbean congregation some of which had been impacted, and also being seen as a safe space through which the surrounding Caribbean community to actually, like a centre, to come and seek information about how to claim back, claim and be provided with some justice. And my thoughts on state infiltration, I'll call it infiltration or surveilling, is that it's very much a case of managing the confines within which allows the nation state to continue engaging in racial capitalism being the extraction of economic or social value from other people of other races, and the engagement of the state with community organizations to try and, under the guise of helping or trying to bring a resolution along in a quicker period of time, is very much the extraction of that social value. That very much plays into that concept of racial capitalism. So even though the state can be criticised for allowing such scandals to even come to fruition, in the first place, i.e. the Windrush scandal and others that have gone along with it, at least they're attempting to remedy the wrong and to put things right, essentially. And really what that is that's also that quelling of a Black radical response. This idea.
Yeah, also, yeah, thank you so much for that response. I think it's also putting it within the historical context as well, and the transnational context, which you talked about. Really, you were talking about transnationalist identities as well, which I thought was really fascinating, the way that these movements speak with one another, learn from one another, and kind of strategize together as well. But equally, as movements do this, the state is always doing the same, and yeah, just to this was very much a strategy, right, of the US government. It's not something that we haven't seen before, of Caribbean governments, of of colonial occupiers as well. So yeah, it's just trying to place those kind of tactics within a kind of broader seeing it through a broader historical lens, and maybe asking what the motivations are behind those, this kind of idea of states who are doing good, or at least they're helping something. But I think I'm quite pessimistic, I think, in terms of what is, when you dig a bit deeper about what the actual underlying motivations are for a lot of this.
Yeah, and another point that's really interesting is the budgets that have to be set aside by governments in addressing issues that are taking place transnationally, and not necessarily just in terms of defense budgets and all of those things, but also community management. We now live in a globalized world where something happens in one part of the world, there are protests everywhere. With the situation with George Floyd, there was protests in every single continent except Antarctica. And so the governments of those nations now have to place money aside to fund police and to fund security to man those protests. So essentially it does factor into just the pounds and the pence. Is it cheaper for us to go down and negotiate and say that we put out a statement and condemn this government and that government, hoping that it doesn't impact any sort of trade deals that we have going on at this time? Or do we spend the exorbitant amount of money that's required to send the police down and calm everything down? And is it inevitable anyway? So the strategies that national governments use to attempt to fragment transnational support of political issues, not even necessarily in other Western nations, but even in the continent of Africa, the whole SARS movement that originated in Nigeria a few years ago, and the international response of that by the Nigerian diaspora and also other nations of the African diaspora as well, was something that very much has to be factored into not just the political trajectory, but the economic trajectory of the country, and also attempting to maintain a favourable, the favourable face of democracy. This concept of humanism and egalitarianism that really doesn't in real life exist in democracy. So yes, and thank you for that insight. I might pop that in actually. That point. Thank you.
Do we have any other questions? I know we've only got about 10 minutes left. But I actually had, well, it's not really, it is a question, but it's a follow-on point from what you and Eve were just discussing then. And it's, if we sort of flip this on its head and look at it from the perspectives of these activists who were, because you mentioned supplementary schools before, and it's one of the massive debates there was, do we accept state funding, or do we rely on the unpaid labor of Black women and men who were already at the bottom rungs of the economic system? Do we accept and try and resist any form of co-option and try and do what we can do with the money given by the state, or do we just rely on even more sort of hard work by these men and women? So there's a line that it's not really been figured out yet, how to find that balance. But I was just wondering if you had any thoughts or any other examples of that.
I do. There's a long history of that discussion of giving up political agitation or the seeking for political justice in order to meet one's immediate needs. So one's human needs that is only fulfilled through economic gain, right? So American examples, the Atlanta Compromise, which essentially was the American, I'm not really sure what to call him, figure, Booker T. Washington, who was a Black conservative who very much encouraged individuals of the South to forego political progress or agitative political activity in order to be provided more rights, access to training, training for jobs and being able to make a way for you to feed your family, and then in exchange be provided with the money that was required to train, go to the Tuskegee Institute, pay one's fees and get a good job. In the British context, that whole, well, in American context a little bit later on, Huey Newton very much referred to the community services that the Black Panther Party provided, and there was over 100 of them. I think there may have even been more. They were state funded, a majority of them were state funded. Of course, they were funded from other sources like book sales of Black Panther members, and also donations. But a large chunk of the programs were funded by the state, which they didn't always do what they should do. They did go and buy guns with this money, as well as they did pay for community programs. But Huey Newton famously referred to the acceptance of that money as survival politics. We're surviving till we can thrive. We are maintaining the strength of the community and educating them and giving them everything that they need, so that once we get to the point, we can then get everybody involved in building this counter-publican, or continue to build the Black counter-public. In the research that I conducted, finding that balance is raised again in the second analysis chapter, where I speak about the younger members as neoliberal subjects existing simultaneously as neoliberal subjects and Black radical subjects, which is a confliction that the elder generation never really had to cope with, because they were more absolutely marginalized for society than their younger counterparts were. The younger board members had to contend with being born following the neoliberalization of the British society, but the higher education system as well. And so having access to higher education in a way that their parents and grandparents never did, and thus being entered into the neoliberal labour market in we all know, we're all those people, where you have to continuously be gaining human capital, whether it be in the form of education or qualification or skills, in order to increase your earning power. And so the younger members, because they were university graduates, they were all in middle class degrees. All of the university graduates, bar one, had an undergraduate degree. Four of the eight younger members had a master's degree, and 2 of the 4 with a master's degree had a postdoctoral, had a PhD, and I was in the process of getting mine. So they were all educated, they were all in careers that were aligned with the university degrees that they received. And so alongside their commitment to the organisation, they were all also trying to build their careers. And one thing that came out in discussions with some of the younger members is that many of them had actually gotten involved in the organisation as a means through which to attain more human capital for them to then go and apply to their earning power within the labour market. I.e., we had myself included as a doctoral researcher, I was in the space primarily as a scholar and an activist, but one hand fed the other. And so there were times when activism is hard, being in a community organisation and dealing with the different personalities is hard. And there were times where I sat and said, if I didn't need this data to finish my PhD, I wouldn't be here. And that was I wouldn't be here right now, because I was just so burnt out. And one of the board members, who was a property developer who actually come to help develop one of the properties, when he felt he wasn't being listened to by the older members, and he realised he wasn't going to gain any more experience by being in the board, he left. We had another board member who was an accountant by trade. He was brought into the organisation as a treasurer. When he was facing opposition by the elder members because they wanted to do things their way, the way that they'd been doing it since the 70s, he left. The same thing for another board member who was a broadcasting and media graduate. she had come to head up the the community engagement and media section of the organisation. She left. Everybody that had come into the organisation had done so, yes, for the politics, but also with an individualist, quote unquote, selfish objective in mind, which was to gain some human capital, something to put on the CV to say, I have done this within this space, and use that as a way in which to elevate their earning potential going forward. And this is a major difference between the two generations. You're not coming into the space with nothing anymore. You have an education, you have everything you would need to go and live a comfortable life as yourself. So then you constantly have to have this discussion with yourself about whether you want to continue to prioritize the collective or whether you choose yourself when it all gets too much. And that's very much the contemporary version of that balance.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And well, we're out of time, but I just want to say a big thank you. I thought it was excellent.
Oh, I hope so. Sorry,
I'm sure everyone will echo my thoughts. Thank you again. And thank you all for joining us as well.
Thank you very much for coming, everyone. I appreciate it.